Hi, everyone.
Hello again. We're in the section Blood and Life, Law and Love in Ray Franz's In Search of Christian Freedom. Under the subsection Abstain from Blood, Ray has made the connection between Leviticus, the blood restriction, in Acts 15, and Leviticus 17 that most witnesses are familiar with, but less familiar are they with what surrounds Leviticus 17, other restrictions that are also brought up in Acts chapter 15. So he expands on that here, talking about the application of these principles in the Jewish synagogues of the diaspora, that is, the scattered Jews. While the land of Israel itself was now under Gentile control, with large numbers of Jews living outside in various countries, those doing so being called the diaspora, meaning the scattered ones, James knew that in many cities throughout the Roman Empire, the Jewish community was like a microcosm, reflecting the situation in Palestine in ancient times, in that it was quite common for Gentiles to attend synagogue gatherings of the Jews and thus to mingle with them. The early Christians themselves, both Jewish and Gentile Christians, continued to frequent these synagogue gatherings, even as we know that Paul and others did much of their preaching and teaching there. James' reference to the reading of Moses in the synagogues in city after city certainly gives basis for believing that when listing the things he had immediately before named, he had in mind the abstentions that Moses had set forth for Gentiles within the Jewish community in ancient times. As we have seen, James listed not only the very same things found in the book of Leviticus, but even in the very same order: abstention from idolatrous sacrifice, blood, things strangled, hence unbled, and from sexual immorality. He recommended observance of those same abstentions on the part of Gentile believers, and the evident reason for this abstention was the circumstance then prevailing, that of an intermixture of Jew and Gentile in the Christian gatherings, and the need to maintain peace and harmony within that circumstance. When Gentile Christians were urged to abstain from blood, this clearly was to be understood not in some all-embracing sense, but in the specific sense of refraining from eating blood, something abhorrent to Jews. To take the matter beyond that and to try to assign to blood of itself a sort of taboo status is to lift the matter out of its scriptural and historical context and to impose upon it a meaning that is not actually there.
Notably, James did not list such things as murder or theft among the abstentions urged. Those things were already condemned as much among the Gentiles in general as among the Jews. But the Gentiles did condone idolatry, did condone eating of blood and eating of unbled animals, and condone sexual immorality, even having temple prostitutes connected with places of worship. The recommended abstentions then focused on those areas of Gentile practice that were most likely to create great offense for Jews and result in friction and disturbance. The Mosaic Law had not required circumcision for alien residents as a condition for living in peace with Israel, and neither did James urge this.
The letter that resulted from James's recommendation was directed specifically to Gentile Christians, people from the nations in Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia, regions stretching contiguously, that is, next to each other, to the north of Israel. And as we have seen, it dealt with the specific issue of an attempt to require Gentile believers to observe the law of Moses. It dealt with those areas of conduct most likely to create difficulty between Jewish and Gentile believers. As will be demonstrated later, there's nothing to indicate that the letter was intended to be viewed as law, as though the 4 abstentions urged formed a quadrilogue, replacing the Decalogue or 10 Commandments of the Mosaic Law. It was specific counsel for a specific circumstance prevailing at that period of history.
There's a couple of good footnotes that we probably should read as well. The first one is, here again, if one assigned an absolute sense to the expression to abstain from blood, viewing it as some kind of blanket prohibition, This would mean that one could not submit to blood tests of any kind, could not undergo surgery unless it were a bloodless kind, and in other ways would have to stay away from blood in every respect. The context gives no indication that such a blanket prohibition was intended, and indicates instead that the injunction was directed specifically to the actual eating of blood. And the second footnote says, as far back as April 15, 1909, the Watchtower recognized this as the intent of the letter, saying, the things here recommended were necessary to a preservation of the fellowship of the body, composed of Jews and Gentiles, with their different education and sentiments.
Well, that's pretty depressing that in Charles Russell's day they knew. The Bible students were told that this had to do with Jewish Gentile sensitivities.
Yeah, so they were looking more at the settings of the letters, like where it was and who the audience was. They were paying attention to it. So they do a better job than they do currently.
Well, it just underlines that assumption that many of the ex-witness community have already made, that Rutherford and his cohorts set up a lot of these prohibitions, including the blood, which is, after all, after World War II, when Rutherford was already dead. But a lot of those things that separate Jehovah's Witnesses from everybody else, it looks like were deliberately chosen just to alienate.
Yeah, so it's to create a separation between them and the churches.
And everybody else.
And everyone, yes.
So it's so ironic that this very passage that is almost a tribute to the early Christian apostolic effort to keep the unity of the church despite the difference of backgrounds.
Yeah.
To keep the unity of the church, this extreme effort is made, and a decision is made that alienated, no doubt, many Christians from each other. But that's because they kept their prejudices and especially the Jewish element wanted to keep their separation from the Gentiles.
Yeah. But it was desire to unite them, to make more compassion on both sides to the other point of view.
So that the irony is so marked that what initiative was in the first century to keep the church united has become another distinctive to separate Jehovah's Witnesses from everybody else, including the Jews.
Yeah.
After all, they're kosher. In the next segment, Ray discusses, why do people accept these kind of absolute rigid prohibitions?